Greetings. In this video, I'll be going over some top speed estimates regarding the 2022 Scat Pack Challenger and Charger, as well as the 2022 Mustang GT S550. It is my position that the Mustang GT is aerodynamically capable of over 184 miles per hour when delimited, possibly 186, while the fastest Scat Pack is somewhere around 180, 179, or 181 depending on conditions. These numbers will be based on aerodynamic drag calculations from the website RB Racing, whose calculations I have found to be extremely accurate. RB Racing is a Bonneville top speed racing team or concern. That is to say that top speed and calculations like these are all that they do. So they're pretty much bang on. Before I get into the data points, I feel I need to address the other calculators out there for the same metric, all of which I found to give very low horsepower requirements for a given speed. Requirements that are unreasonably low. If these calculators were correct, both cars would be limited by their respective gear ratios at roughly 185 to 195 miles per hour, and both would be able to easily exceed 180 miles an hour, as easily as either exceeds 165 to 170 miles an hour. None of this is actually true, so none of these other calculators are correct, in my humble opinion. With that out of the way, we can begin by collecting data points for the Scat Packs. As there are multiple good videos of these cars meeting or nearly meeting their top speeds, we can compare the calculations against the video evidence, checking to see if the calculator is accurate before we move on to the Mustang, which is mostly going to be estimates, as nobody has actually filmed a stock Mustang reaching aerodynamic top speed because the Mustang has a couple governors in it, one at 165 miles an hour and then a hard-coded one in the PCM at 183. The reason you're never going to find a stock Mustang exceeding any of those limits is because nobody would really go into the PCM to remove such limits and not tune the car at the same time. So it's impossible to find data points regarding that theoretical aerodynamic limit of the body with stock horsepower. So Mopar and Stellantis make it very easy to get data for any of their cars with publicly available spec sheets containing any and all relevant data for things like this. Anything from interior room to swept brake area, they're on these sheets. I cannot understate how convenient this is, as the same can't be said of Ford, who have really no published data that's relevant to these tests. In fact, Ford still hasn't published a coefficient of drag for the S550 Mustang in any trim. So moving along, as you can see, this sheet contains everything we're going to need: drag coefficient, frontal area, and curb weight. In the case of the Charger Scat Pack Narrowbody, these numbers are 0.335 for the drag coefficient, 26.2 square feet for the frontal area, and 4,500 pounds for the curb weight with a driver. For all the cars tested, I used a 150-pound driver for the calculations. Before we plug these numbers in, I should really explain what it is that's being calculated for. Drag is an aerodynamic force that resists the movement of a body through the air, or any fluid. In this case, it's air. There are a couple types of drag. Well, more than a couple, but induced and parasite are the two relevant ones right now. Induced being relevant at lower speeds, and parasite drag being relevant at higher speeds, which we're discussing today. Drag increases with the square of airspeed over a surface at higher speeds, meaning at the velocities that we are discussing today, the drag forces will increase greatly from even, say, a 5 mile per hour change in given speed. Now, a car's drag coefficient is a number that represents how easily it moves through the air, or any object really has a drag coefficient, and that just represents how easy it cuts through the air. A lot of sport cars rest around 0.35 to 0.36. Family cars are a lot lower, some in the 0.28 range, like the Mercedes S-Class. I think a 2016 S-Class is like 0.28. Not that it's relevant to what we're discussing here, but And that's what drag coefficient represents, how easily an object slips through the air. Frontal area is self-explanatory, as well as weight. Frontal area including the mirrors for all of these, as best as we can calculate for the Mustang. Weight itself isn't that relevant to top speed. It's more relevant to acceleration and lower speed calculations, as it has a higher bearing on induced drag as opposed to parasite drag. So when taking all these numbers together, you can accurately calculate how much wheel horsepower is needed to move an object of that given shape and size through the air. So now, knowing all this, we can calculate for the narrow-body Scat Pack Charger the wheel horsepower requirements for various speeds starting at 175 miles per hour. So this will be a 410 wheel horsepower for 175, 431 for 178, 445 for 180, and 467 at 183 miles per hour. Keeping those numbers in mind, we can calculate the wheel horsepower of the Charger by taking its crank horsepower and accounting for a standard drivetrain loss of about 12%. I'll be using this 12% figure for comparison's sake after having looked at multiple dyno charts and claims for the Scat Pack twins, all ranging around the calculated figure of 426.8. That's the 12% standard loss, the 426.8 wheel horsepower. I've seen charts ranging as low as 405 wheel horsepower all the way up to nearly 440 wheel horsepower. This standard 12% deduction will be used for the Mustang as well, since again, after looking at the charts, the wheel horsepower range all the way from about 376 to about 410 is the highest I saw, and the calculated figure is 396. That rests comfortably in the middle. In addition, this is also to keep the comparison as fair as possible between the two cars, as this is primarily to compare two theoretically average cars, two standard cars, not cherry-picking the best Mopar figures for the worst Ford figures, and vice versa. These are standard cars on a standard day. Since now that we've calculated our wheel horsepower figure of 426.8 horsepower, we can now compare that and see that the narrow-body Charger should top out around roughly 176 miles per hour. Since at that speed the horsepower requirements will exceed the actual produced horsepower. With that calculated data point in hand, it's time to consult some video evidence of actual top speed runs in a narrow-body Charger Scat Pack. So, what happened? Both videos clearly show that the actual top speed lies somewhere in the 179 mile per hour to the 180 mile per hour range, indicating that the calculation is incorrect. So clearly the RSR calculator is faulty. Not quite. There's a very important factor that hasn't been considered when discussing high-speed power, this being the performance boost gained from the ram air effect. Ram air is the use of the car's forward motion to raise manifold pressure above standard atmospheric conditions. At typical highway speeds, this effect is almost nil, about 0.7% raise in pressure at 75 miles per hour. But like drag, this increases with the square of airspeed, resulting in about 3% pressure gain at 150 miles per hour and 4% at 180. It's 5% roughly at 200, but we're not going that high. This 4% gain is assuming no change in density in the air due to temperature increases. It's also assuming a unrestricted airway, a perfectly optimized intake that can completely utilize this 4% increase in ambient pressure. So what will this net us? Assuming all things are equal and no restrictions in the intake, no change in temperature, this sort of thing, an increase in manifold pressure will result in a proportional increase in horsepower. That is to say, a 1% increase in manifold pressure will result in a 1% increase in horsepower. So at 180 miles per hour, we will be getting a 4% bump in wheel horsepower. Well, the thing is, I can't really account for all the variables in the intake geometry, intake temperature, this sort of thing. So I will use 3.3% as kind of a rough spitball at what could be actually gained at these speeds with the stock intake setup. This 3.3% number I feel is a bit conservative. I feel it might be closer to 3.5. All these intakes on these cars are really well optimized, especially the Challengers, which pull air directly from one of the headlights. I feel that works really well and would take almost full advantage of the ram air effect, but that's neither here nor there. 3.3% is the standard number I'm going to be using to correct wheel horsepower for all the cars, Mustang included. Using this 4.4% correction, using this 3.3% increase, we can see that the wheel horsepower is now 440 wheel horsepower. This lands us completely in line with all the actual top speed calculations at 179 to 180 miles per hour. That 5 horsepower difference, that's really not a lot. The 5 horsepower is really just a dynamometer error. One day you can bring your car to the dyno, it runs 5 horsepower high, 5 horsepower low, etc., etc. 5 horsepower is really within the noise, so to speak. This is all to say, the calculator is accurate. These calculated numbers that we have for wheel horsepower fall directly in line with both the video evidence and the aerodynamic drag calculator that we have available to us through RSR. It also shows how important it is to actually be able to utilize ram air properly if you're actually planning on doing high speed passes, say like a standing mile or standing 2 mile, or you go to Bonneville for Speed Week or something like this. Ram air is very important, doubly so if you're using a supercharged car or turbocharged car, especially a roots type blower. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds with this. It is now time to move on to the Challenger Scat Pack, and then the wide bodies after that. Taking our numbers from another very convenient Stellantis spec sheet, I can't praise them enough, they really are wonderful. We use the 0.365 number for our coefficient of drag, 26 square feet as the frontal area, and then 4,450 pounds as our weight. This results in 439 wheel horsepower at 175 miles per hour, 469 at 179, and a whopping 493 at 182 miles per hour. This should really show that the Challenger is not exactly a 180 mile per hour capable car. From these results, we can see that the Challenger is very drag limited, with a calculated top speed of roughly 175 miles per hour and not too much more. So consulting my one and only video of a Scat Pack Challenger Narrowbody, we can compare data again. And again, we can see a car that reaches speeds far in excess of what should be possible, and this time ram air is accounted for, so it gives. For one thing, the car is not stock, having received a tune giving it the wheel horsepower requirements to far exceed likely even 180 miles per hour. The real reason I wanted to show the video is to bring some attention to another contributing factor to higher than calculated top speeds, that being density altitude. It should go without saying that these calculations are all for a standard day meaning 29.95 inches of mercury and 59 degrees Fahrenheit. It should go without saying that these calculations are all for a standard day, meaning 29.95 inches of mercury and 59 degrees Fahrenheit. And all the results that I am arguing for are again for a standard car, standard meaning standard 12% wheel horsepower reduction, and a standard day meaning the previously stated pressure and temperature values, all again at sea level. As shown in the previous video, the ambient temperature was only 30 degrees Fahrenheit. This cooler temperature will result in increased horsepower. We can calculate roughly how much by spitballing the density altitude. Assuming 300 feet of real elevation and standard ambient pressure, we can see that the resultant density altitude is near 1,000 feet below sea level. Assuming 300 feet of real elevation and standard ambient pressure, we can see that the resulting density altitude is near 1,000 feet below sea level. Since we don't actually know the real pressure, elevation, or humidity for that day, we can just assume roughly 1,000 feet of negative elevation. As a rule of thumb, 1,000 feet is equivalent to 3% gain or loss of horsepower, depending if it's a negative change or positive, respectively. Again, coming back to the 440 wheel horsepower figure, we can now calculate the 3% gain, resulting in 454 wheel horsepower, actually bringing us somewhat close to the horsepower requirements for that 179 figure. Obviously, this is all irrelevant to the video because the car was indeed tuned, but this does go to show how much atmospheric conditions will affect horsepower. This Challenger also demonstrates the accuracy of the calculator in a way, mainly in the sense that all published numbers are 175 miles per hour for the Challenger Scat Pack, and the calculator does come up with roughly 175 miles per hour of top speed, and the only video showing a Challenger Scat Pack exceeding 175 miles per hour is one that is decidedly not a stock car. So with this in hand, it's reasonable to assume that the calculator is indeed accurate to a fairly close margin, one that we can use to compare cars at least. Now to move on to the calculations for the wide-body models. Now again, coming back to the very convenient info sheets, we can see that the Charger wide-body has a drag coefficient of 0.38 and more frontal area at 27.2 square feet, with the Challenger being worse at 0.398 for the drag coefficient and 26.8 square feet of frontal area. I'm going to kind of just gloss over these two. I couldn't find any real videos showing Scat Pack wide bodies hitting top speeds. For some reason, only narrow body Scat Packs, but I think we might find out exactly why in a minute. Some may be wondering just how much worse a seemingly small change like this might have. It seems small when you look at the numbers in isolation, but trust me, 0.335 to 0.38 is a huge change. Likewise with 0.365 to 0.398. These are massive differences in terms of drag coefficient. And you can see this when looking at the results of the calculations. The wide-body Charger now needs 436 horsepower to go 170 miles per hour, as opposed to the same horsepower requirements to reach 180. It needs 452 wheel horsepower for 172 miles per hour, and at 175, it needs 475 wheel horsepower. This is completely unreasonable. So if anybody tells you there's stock Scat Pack wide body, Charger at least, or Challenger for that matter, because the numbers are worse for the Challenger, 449 wheel horsepower to hit 170, and 488 for 175. If anybody tells you a stock Scat Pack, Challenger, or Charger is exceeding speeds of 175 miles per hour, even meeting speeds of 175 miles per hour, that's something you should take with a grain of salt. What's most likely happening is the cars are either A, not stock, B, have a uncalibrated speedometer, a badly calibrated speedometer with some margin of error, or C, they were traveling slightly downhill and didn't notice. I find the third one to be extremely likely for many cases, because a lot of the times the grading in a highway is very subtle, and even, you won't notice it, especially at that sort of speed. You have other things to focus on. To conclude this first portion, the narrow-body Charger can be concluded to be a legitimate 180 mile per hour car, maybe 181 mile per hour car on a good day. The Challenger is a 175 mile per hour car, and the wide bodies barely crack into the 170s. This also helps illustrate how accurate this calculator actually is when you correct for all the for all the necessary figures, that being wheel horsepower correction, and in our case, ram air correction. Moving on to the Mustang, the first hurdle for this comparison was actually getting any published numbers. It's something I was completely unable to do. Other people have contacted Ford directly about getting drag coefficient numbers and frontal area data, and Ford pretty much told them to kick rocks. They gave them some sort of generic marketing spiel, and once pressed to actually get specific numbers, they just stopped responding entirely. I'll have a forum post on screen now showing the guy who contacted Ford about this. The guy is a certified Ford tuner. He's also the one who found the 183 mile per hour PCM limit. I think he's also the one who brought up the 183 miles an hour being close to the aerodynamic top speed of the car. So after digging around, I found that Ford does actually have spec sheets for some of their cars. The only issue is that the feature on their website to get these is extremely finicky, and I was only able to pull the S550 numbers once, and then never again. After that, it was only the S650 spec sheets that came up, and even still, the numbers published only gave frontal dimensions and no other relevant information for this comparison. If you wanted to find out how many adults you can put in the rear seats of the Mustang, the sheet tells you. If you want a good info on the car's performance, you can get bent. I should have an example of this on screen now, just to give an idea of how sparse the information actually is compared to the Mopar spec sheets. And note again that these spec sheets are for an S650. Like I said previously, the S550 sheet only came up once, and then it was gone forever. To be perfectly blunt, this sort of opaqueness when it comes to performance numbers is borderline unacceptable from Ford. I would have legitimately expected better, especially regarding the performance models. Especially considering the sort of aftermarket these cars have. At the very least, though, I found the rough frontal dimensions. With these, I can now estimate roughly the frontal area, and then see if the results are in the ballpark of reasonability. For this, I used horsepowerwizard.com. They've got a pretty decent calculator to estimate both the drag coefficients and the frontal area. As kind of pokey as this website looks, the calculations are fairly decent as far as I can tell. I did a little bit of experimentation with it, and they're okay, close enough for our purposes. They fall in line with the only other estimate for coefficient of drag I was able to find, that being 0.32. Although that is a bit of a lie. I did find one site claiming 0.29. It is either a website or it was Google's automated information feature. It claimed 0.29 for a drag coefficient number, but I didn't screenshot it. And I wouldn't have used it anyway, since it seems unreasonably low in my opinion. More on that later though. As you have been seeing going on screen now, by giving the rough body shape of the Mustang, the horsepower wizard calculator calculates roughly what the coefficient of drag would be based on a car with those generic proportions, and that seems to be 0.323, a number that I'm comfortable with since the only other published estimate was 0.32. Additionally, Ford has made claims that the 183 mile per hour limiter is close to the aerodynamic top speed, and this claim, I wish I screenshotted it, but trust me, it was made, and with a slightly less aerodynamic body than 0.32 or 0.323, this wouldn't really be possible. As you saw with the Charger correction, with only a really small increase to 0.335 to reach 180 miles per hour, you need 440 roughly wheel horsepower. And with the Mustang having 450 crank horsepower, this would be unattainable with a 0.33 or 0.335 drag coefficient. This also falls in line with the claimed focus that the engineering team had with aerodynamics with this body, and I highly doubt that a 2022 Mustang would have a higher coefficient of drag than a 2010 Charger, this being 0.34 roughly. At the bare minimum, the coefficient of drag is probably equivalent to the 2022 Charger. Highly likely it's slightly better, somewhere around 0.32, possibly 0.31. The frontal area seems fine, but again, it's just another estimate based on the raw dimensions of the car and a standard deduction. If anyone actually has wind tunnel results for an S550, I would love to have them, but unfortunately all I have are these estimates, though I believe them to be reasonably close for our purposes. So now, after some headache, we can calculate the aerodynamic top speed of the 2022 Mustang GT. First, to get our wheel horsepower number, 396, that's 450 multiplied by 0.88, and then correct for ram air pressure. This results in a total wheel horsepower rating of about 409, again give or take a little bit here and there. Now with this number in hand, we can add our coefficient of drag of 0.323, a frontal area of 23.31 square feet, and weight of 3880 pounds. The curb weight being one of the few published numbers for the Mustang from Ford. At 175 miles per hour, we can see that the horsepower requirement is only 352 horsepower at the tires. Assuming both the Mustang and Charger are racing at these speeds, the Mustang would be accelerating away from the Charger quite quickly, since at this speed it has much more excess power, meaning it's got more free horsepower that's not tied up in fighting drag. Remember, again, at 175, you would need the uncorrected horsepower number of 420 wheel horsepower out of a possible 440, leaving 20 horsepower to accelerate the car forward. With a Mustang 352 out of 409, that leaves you 50-something horsepower to accelerate the car. So moving along to 180 miles per hour, the horsepower requirements now are 382, still a long way off from that 409 wheel horsepower figure. Now to go directly to the 183 mile per hour limit of the car, where the requirements are now reaching 401 horsepower. The Mustang would still be accelerating at this point, albeit slowly. We can now see at 184, this would be roughly the limit, requiring 408 wheel horsepower. It could top out potentially at 185, though the likelihood of this is debatable. I'd say it's fairly likely, given the numbers for the Charger and the margin of error for that. Though, just for fun, let's take a look at 186 let's take a look at 186 miles per hour, this requiring 421 horsepower. Still not too far off the 409 wheel horsepower number, though comfortably out of reach for the car, I'd say. Excluding some, extraneous circumstances, even maybe a cat back exhaust would allow the car to hit 186. But at this point, really, we're splitting hairs 1 mile an hour, here or there. There is unfortunately no video evidence of a stock Mustang reaching these speeds. This can be explained pretty easily. For instance, going into the PCM to remove these limiters, you would have no reason not to improve the fuel and timing map at the same time. There's almost nobody who's going out and removing these limiters, except for the express purpose of then testing the car with stock power to these speeds, which is guaranteed to be nobody, except for probably me if I were to ever buy one of these cars. But the short answer is we have nothing to compare these data points to directly. The next best thing I do have is a picture of a German fellow reaching 282 kilometers per hour, or 175 miles per hour, verified through the GPS with a lightly modified Ecoboost Mustang. To be precise, the modifications being a new intake, larger intercooler, and Cobb V3 access port stage 1 tune for 93 octane fuel. As the owner states, the car was still accelerating quite hard, beyond what would be provided by a slight decline, even at these speeds, so we can come to a couple conclusions. Either the Ecoboost was putting down well over 350 wheel horsepower, or the Mustang is more slippery than was previously thought. So let's explore this first option. Is it reasonable for this car to be putting out 350 wheel horsepower? It's difficult to say. The stock wheel horsepower for the Ecoboost is 273, so for it to produce enough horsepower to accelerate past 175 miles per hour comfortably, you would need to pick up about 100 wheel horsepower. The only other similarly modified Ecoboost I've seen is from Eurocompulsion, and it produced roughly 310 to 315 wheel horsepower. I may be misremembering this point. If so, I will put a correction on screen now. Though without comparing the tunes directly, this means little to nothing. I'm reasonably sure that the Eurocompulsion Ecoboost never raised peak boost numbers, and I have no clue if this access port tune does or doesn't improve boost numbers either. If the Cobb tune does provide more boost, this isn't the most unreasonable thing. From personal experience, my buddy had a Mark V Jetta TFSI, and with an intake, downpipe, and tune gained 90 wheel horsepower, going from 170 to 260 wheel horsepower. So, in theory, a piggyback tune adding somewhere in excess of 80 to 100 wheel horsepower isn't insane, although it's unlikely in my opinion. Typically, a lot of these piggyback tunes are fairly conservative, although it's not impossible. The second, and probably more likely option given the evidence, is that the Mustang actually has a drag coefficient significantly less than 0.323, possibly even close to 0.30. With a coefficient of drag of 0.30, we can see the horsepower requirement reduced to 330 wheel horsepower. This brings the requirements within the realm of a very aggressive piggyback tune. I personally will refrain from speculation on this reduced drag coefficient of 0.30, since it legitimately is pure speculation based on some fairly tentative estimates. For all I know, the Cobb tune could ram 8 more PSI into the car. This would fairly easily bring it to 350 wheel horsepower. Either way, it's pretty obvious that even with the 0.32 coefficient of drag, the Mustang is faster everywhere at high speeds than any of the Mopars. This ranges from 4 miles per hour over the Charger to over 12 miles per hour for the wide bodies. More importantly, it pulls harder at these high speeds due to less of its available power being tied up in fighting drag directly. Hopefully at some point in the future though, official numbers for the Mustang will be released, or even better, somebody actually just delimits a Mustang without tuning it and tests the top speed at this setting so these numbers can have some hard evidence to back them up. Before I go, on a personal note, directly to Tim Cox, I do apologize for how I spoke to you in my comments. Although, when I did say that I hope you stick with the hobby and learn lots about cars, I was being genuine. The car hobby is starting to really die out, and the more people with genuine interest in cars, the better. And honestly, anybody who's willing to argue with some rando on YouTube comments for a solid hour or 2 hours, I think it was the better part of a day, actually. That's some real passion about cars, and I'm not using that lightly. Hopefully this exchange hasn't soured your opinion of the hobby, and I hope you keep your interest in cars alive and well. Well, with that, thanks for watching. I hope you all enjoy your day.